The rope cut deep into Sarah's wrists as her father dragged her up the dusty mountain trail like a stubborn mule. Each stumble sent sharp stones through her worn boots. But Ezra Caldwell didn't slow his pace or look back at his pregnant daughter's tears. "Please, Pa," she whispered, but he jerked the rope harder. The isolated cabin came into view just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch. Her belongings, what little remained after he'd burned the rest, lay scattered in the dirt where he'd thrown them from his saddlebags. A figure emerged from the cabin's dark doorway, tall, weathered, with hands that had known hard work and harder choices. This was Jacob Morrison, the mountain man who lived alone by choice and necessity. Ezra shoved Sarah forward, and she collapsed to her knees in the dust, clutching her swollen belly. "She's your problem now," he declared, dropping the rope at Jacob's boots. "Do what you want with her." Without another word, without even a glance at his daughter, Ezra mounted his horse and rode away, leaving only settling dust and the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs. Jacob stood motionless for a long moment, studying the broken woman at his feet. Then he did something that would change everything. He knelt down to her level and spoke the first gentle word she'd heard in months. "What's your name, Miss?" The question hung in the mountain air like morning mist, so unexpected that Sarah's tears stopped mid-fall. She looked up through tangled brown hair at weathered blue eyes that held no cruelty, no judgment, only a quiet patience she'd forgotten could exist. "Sarah," she stammered, waiting for the inevitable questions about her condition, her shame, her worthlessness. Instead, Jacob Morrison simply nodded and extended his hand. "I'm Jacob. Let's get you inside, Sarah." But to understand how she'd come to this moment, kneeling in the dirt before a stranger who spoke her name like she was still human, we need to go back 2 months, to when her world first shattered. It was a Sunday morning when her mother found the torn dress hidden under her bed, the telltale stains that couldn't be scrubbed away. Sarah had knelt in that same kitchen where she'd learned to bake bread and mend clothes, watching her mother's face crumble as the truth became undeniable. "Oh, child," her mother had whispered, "what have you done?" The sound of her father's boots on the porch had ended any hope of gentle handling. Ezra Caldwell was a man who built his reputation on righteousness and moral authority. He led prayers at the church social, quoted scripture at town meetings, and made sure everyone knew the Caldwell family stood for decency and God-fearing values. A pregnant, unmarried daughter threatened everything. "Who?" he demanded, his voice cold as January wind. When Sarah whispered James Patterson's name, the banker's son who'd promised marriage and then disappeared when the railroad job called, her father's face had turned to stone. The beating came first, then the locking in the root cellar, then the burning. Sarah watched from her prison window as her father fed her dresses, her books, her mother's lace curtains to the flames. Each item that marked her as his daughter turned to ash and smoke. "You're dead to me," he'd said through the cellar door that final night. "Come morning, you're someone else's burden." The town had watched in silence as he'd loaded her onto his horse like cargo. Former friends turned their backs. The preacher's wife spat in the dust as they passed. Even the children she'd taught Sunday school to, threw stones and called her names their parents had whispered just loud enough to hear. Sarah had become what every unmarried woman feared most, a cautionary tale, a living example of sin's consequences, a person whose very existence shamed decent folk. But now, in the fading light of a mountain cabin, A stranger was offering his hand as if she deserved basic human kindness. "I can stand," she whispered, not trusting the gesture. "I'm sure you can," Jacob replied, hand still extended. "But you don't have to." The simple words broke something inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart to survive these months of hatred and judgment. Fresh tears came, but these felt different, cleaner somehow. She took his hand. His grip was steady, calloused from honest work, and he helped her to her feet with the careful attention he might give a wounded bird. No rush, no impatience, no commentary on her swollen belly or tear-stained face. "Your belongings," he said, nodding toward the scattered items in the dirt. "They're not much," Sarah said, shame coloring her voice. "They're yours," Jacob replied, as if that settled the matter completely. As they gathered her few possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a wooden brush, Sarah kept stealing glances at this man who'd inherited her like an unwanted debt, but treated her like a guest. The sound of distant hoofbeats made her freeze, one hand clutching her mother's Bible, the other instinctively protecting her belly. Every muscle in her body tensed for flight, though she had nowhere left to run. "Easy." Jacob's voice cut through her panic, low and steady as bedrock. Just wild horses coming down to the creek for water. But the damage was done. Sarah's whole body shook like a leaf in a storm. Her breathing shallow and quick. The sound of hoofbeats, any hoofbeats, meant pursuit, meant being dragged back to face worse punishment, meant the end of whatever fragile safety this moment offered. Jacob watched her terror with understanding eyes. "They can't reach you here," he said quietly, "and they won't try." "You don't know my father," Sarah whispered. "He's not a man who forgives." "Maybe not," Jacob acknowledged, gathering up her scattered belongings. "But I'm not a man who surrenders." The words were said simply, matter-of-factly, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. This was a man who'd made his decision and would stand by it, whatever the cost. Inside the cabin, Sarah's expectations shattered like glass hitting stone. She'd prepared herself for a savage's den, animal hides on the floor, filth in the corners, the crude dwelling of a man who'd abandoned civilization. Instead, she found herself in a space that spoke of quiet dignity and careful order. The wooden floors were swept clean, books lined a shelf near the stone fireplace. A table and 2 chairs sat positioned to catch the morning light through glass windows, real glass, not scraped hide or oiled paper. The bed in the corner was neatly made with a quilt that showed the careful stitching of loving hands. "Sit," Jacob said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll get you some water." Sarah sank into the chair, her hand automatically cradling her belly. The baby stirred inside her, perhaps sensing the change from constant tension to unexpected peace. She watched Jacob move about the kitchen area with economic grace, lighting the oil lamp as evening shadows lengthened, pumping water from a well-maintained hand pump, setting a tin cup before her without ceremony. The water was cold and clean, tasting of mountain springs and sky. Sarah drank deeply, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd had enough of anything: food, water, kindness. "When did you last eat?" Jacob asked, already moving toward the pantry. Sarah's voice caught. The question was so simple, so practical, asked without judgment about her circumstances or condition. "This morning, some bread." Jacob nodded and began assembling a meal with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to caring for himself. Salt pork sizzled in the iron pan. Beans soaked from the night before went into a pot. Cornbread batter mixed with practiced ease. "I can help," Sarah offered, starting to rise. "You can sit," Jacob replied firmly but gently. "Rest is what you need right now." As he cooked, Sarah studied him in the lamplight. Mid-30s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under the open sky. His hair was dark brown with traces of early gray at the temples. His clothes were work-worn but clean, his movements deliberate and sure. Most telling were his hands, scarred from honest labor, but gentle in their work, mixing batter and tending the fire with the same careful attention he'd shown in helping her to her feet. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Jacob glanced over his shoulder. "Why what?" "Why are you being kind to me? My own father—" Her voice broke. "Your father's choices are his to make," Jacob said, turning back to the stove, "just like mine are mine to make." It was a simple statement, but it held a weight of conviction that Sarah had rarely heard. This man had looked at her situation, pregnant, abandoned, carrying another man's shame, and chosen kindness over convenience, compassion over judgment. The meal, when it came, was the finest she'd tasted in months, not because of elaborate preparation or expensive ingredients, but because it was given freely, shared without conditions, offered with the same respect he might show any guest at his table. They ate mostly in silence, but it was comfortable quiet, the peace of two people sharing food and shelter without need for constant words. Outside, the mountain evening settled around them with cricket songs and the distant call of a night bird. As the meal ended, Jacob stood and began clearing the table. "You'll take the bed," he said matter-of-factly. "I couldn't." "You're carrying a child," Jacob interrupted gently. "The bed's yours." "But where will you—" "I've got blankets and a good floor." He gestured to the braided rug near the fireplace. "Spent plenty of nights under stars and rain. This is luxury." As he banked the fire for the night and laid out his bedroll, Sarah marveled at this reversal of everything she'd been taught to expect. In her father's house, men's comfort came first. In her father's world, a fallen woman deserved whatever shelter she could find, grateful for scraps and corners. But Jacob Morrison tucked her in with the same care he might show a sick sister, adjusting the quilt to ward off the mountain chill, making sure the oil lamp was within reach, should she need light in the night. "Sleep well, Sarah," he said quietly. "You're safe here." Safe. The word wrapped around her like the warm quilt, a promise she'd almost forgotten could exist. For the first time in months, Sarah closed her eyes without fear of what tomorrow might bring. But sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought the sound that would haunt her until dawn, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, growing closer in the darkness. Sarah woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was real. Horses, multiple horses, their hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth outside the cabin. Moonlight streamed through the window, and in its pale glow she could see Jacob already standing, alert but calm, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Wild mustangs," he whispered, his voice carrying relief and something that might have been amusement. "A whole herd of them, coming down from the high country to drink." Sarah's body slowly released its terror as she watched him move to the window with the easy confidence of a man on his own land. Through the glass, she caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes flowing like water across the moonlit meadow. Beautiful and free. They come through every few weeks, Jacob continued, his voice low so as not to spook the animals. Magnificent creatures, not owned by any man, not answerable to anyone but themselves. There was something in his tone, a respect, perhaps even envy, that made Sarah understand this wasn't just casual observation. These wild horses represented something to him, some freedom he valued above comfort or convention. The moment the words left his lips, Sarah's terror returned full force. Her breathing became quick and shallow, her hands trembling as the familiar panic set in. Every sound meant pursuit. Every hoofbeat meant her father had found her. Jacob turned from the window, taking in her distress with the same quiet assessment he'd shown everything else. Without a word, he crossed to the kitchen and pumped fresh water into a basin, gathered clean cloth, and returned to sit in the chair beside her bed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her wrists where the rope had left angry red marks. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. His touch was feather light as he bathed the rope burns with warm water. Each gentle motion seemed to draw some of the poison from her wounds, not just the physical cuts, but the deeper hurt of being treated like an animal to be bought and sold. "These will heal," he said simply, wrapping her wrists in soft cloth. "Give them time." But Sarah heard the deeper message in his words. The wounds went beyond her wrists, beyond her body, into the very center of who she was, and those wounds, too, might heal with time and gentle care. "I can't read very well," she admitted suddenly, surprising herself. It was the kind of vulnerability she'd learned to hide, but something about his careful tending of her injuries made truth feel safe. "Would you like to learn better?" Jacob asked, without a trace of condescension. And so began their evening ritual. Each night after supper, Jacob would bring his mother's Bible to the small table and light the oil lamp, not to preach or lecture, but to teach. His finger would follow the words as Sarah sounded them out, patient when she stumbled, encouraging when she succeeded. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read slowly one evening. "I shall not want." "Good," Jacob said quietly. "What do you think that means?" Sarah considered, her hand resting unconsciously on her growing belly. That someone's watching over me, even when I can't see them? I think so too." It was the closest thing to a religious conversation they'd had, but Sarah felt more genuine spiritual comfort in Jacob's quiet teaching than in all her father's fire and brimstone sermons combined. The evenings grew easier. Sarah's reading improved. The rope marks on her wrists faded to thin white lines, and slowly, carefully, trust began to take root between them like a plant growing in good soil. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Jacob brought something from the chest at the foot of his bed, a quilt unlike any Sarah had ever seen. The stitching was exquisite, tiny flowers and vines dancing across a background of cream and soft blue. Each patch had been cut and sewn with the kind of love that took time, the kind of care that couldn't be rushed. "My mother made this," Jacob said, unfolding it with reverent hands. "Took her 3 years, working on it evenings after her farm work was done. It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, running her fingers over the intricate patterns. She always said a quilt was more than cloth and thread. It was love you could wrap around yourself on cold nights, comfort you could pass down to your children. That night, when he tucked the precious quilt around Sarah's shoulders, she understood the gift for what it was, not just warmth, but acceptance, not just shelter, but belonging. He was wrapping her in his family's love, claiming her as worthy of his mother's handiwork. Sarah woke the next morning to the sound of steady hammering coming from the barn. Curious, she dressed carefully and made her way outside. Following the rhythmic sound through the crisp mountain air, she found Jacob bent over a work table, planing a piece of pine with long, smooth strokes. Wood shavings curled at his feet like golden ribbons, and the air smelled of fresh sawdust and honest labor. "What are you making?" she asked. Jacob straightened, brushing sawdust from his hands. For a moment, something almost shy crossed his weathered features. "Come see," he said. What Sarah saw took her breath away. There on the workbench, half-finished but unmistakable, was a cradle. The wood was smooth as silk under her fingers, the joints fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. But more than the skill of its making, it was what it represented that made tears spring to her eyes. Hope, future, the radical idea that her child, born of shame and abandonment, deserved beauty and care. "You don't have to," she began. "Every child deserves to sleep safe," Jacob said simply. "This one will." Sarah's hand found her belly, where the baby moved restlessly as if sensing the emotion in the air. For the first time since she'd felt those first flutterings of life, she allowed herself to imagine holding this child, rocking it to sleep in a cradle made with love instead of duty. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words felt too small for what she was feeling. Jacob nodded and returned to his work, adding, "Going to carve some flowers on the headboard, like the ones on my mother's quilt." As Sarah walked back to the cabin, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Behind her, the steady sound of hammering resumed, the sound of a future being built one careful stroke at a time. But that afternoon, as she stood at the window watching Jacob work, a new sound reached her ears. Not the random hoofbeats of wild horses this time, but the deliberate rhythm of a shod horse carrying a rider with purpose, a rider heading straight for their sanctuary. The horseman emerged from the tree line with the bearing of authority, straight-backed in the saddle, a tin star catching the afternoon sunlight, eyes that missed nothing as they swept the cabin and surrounding buildings. Federal Marshal Thompson. Sarah realized with a chill that went bone-deep. She'd seen him in town before, a man who represented the long arm of law and order reaching into every corner of the territory. Jacob emerged from the barn, setting down his hammer with deliberate calm. Sarah pressed herself against the window frame, hidden but listening as the two men faced each other across the dusty yard. "Afternoon, Marshal." Jacob's voice carried the proper respect, but no servility. "Jacob Morrison." Thompson touched the brim of his hat. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Ask away." The marshal's gaze swept the homestead again, noting the two plates visible through the open cabin door. The women's clothing hanging on the line behind the house, the general signs of feminine habitation that a bachelor's cabin wouldn't normally show. "Got a report about a missing person," Thompson said, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Young woman, about 19, brown hair, carrying a child. Name of Sarah Caldwell. Her father's mighty worried about her." Sarah's heart hammered so hard she was certain both men could hear it. Her father, worried. The same man who'd dragged her up this mountain like unwanted cargo and dumped her without a backward glance. Jacob's face revealed nothing. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. Marshall. The lie came so smoothly, so naturally, that Sarah almost believed it herself. But it was a lie nonetheless. Jacob Morrison, the man who'd shown her nothing but honesty and kindness, was risking his reputation and possibly his freedom to protect her. Funny thing, Marshall Thompson continued, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp. Her father says she might have been brought up into these mountains against her will. Says she was troubled and might not be thinking clearly. That so? Jacob's voice remained level, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Course, if someone was harboring her, even with good intentions, that could be seen as interfering with a father's rights, especially if the girl's not in her right mind. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Her father had painted her as insane, incapable of making her own choices, a victim to be rescued from her own bad judgment. It was clever. It made Jacob look like either a criminal or a fool, and her like a woman who couldn't be trusted to speak for herself. I understand the law, Marshall, Jacob said quietly. Man finds someone in trouble on his land. He's got a choice to make. Help or turn away. I've always chosen to help. Admirable quality, Thompson replied. But the law's got its own ideas about what kind of help is proper. The marshal's horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension between the two men. Thompson let the silence stretch, his experienced eyes cataloging every detail of the homestead, the carefully tended garden, the fresh chinked cabin walls, the general air of prosperity that spoke of a man who took care of what was his. Mind if I take a look around? He asked finally. You got a warrant? Jacob's voice carried no challenge, just curiosity. Don't need one for a friendly conversation. Then we're just talking, and you're welcome to what you can see from where you sit. It was a careful dance, both men knowing the steps, both playing their roles with practiced precision. The marshal had authority but not unlimited power. Jacob had rights but not unlimited protection. Thompson's gaze lingered on the cabin windows, and for a moment Sarah was certain he could see her through the glass, could read the terror in her eyes and the truth of her condition. But he made no move toward the house, no demand to search inside. If you do happen to come across this missing girl, the marshal said finally, tucking the paper back in his pocket, her father wants to know she'd be welcomed home. No questions asked, no punishment, just a family reunion. Another lie, and both men knew it. Sarah's father wasn't the forgiving type, and his idea of no punishment wouldn't match anyone else's definition. I'll keep that in mind, Jacob replied. Thompson gathered his reins, but before turning his horse, he delivered one final shot. Course, there's also the matter of the child she's carrying. Father's got rights there too. Being the grandfather and all, wouldn't want some stranger raising a Caldwell baby without proper legal authority. With that parting threat, the marshal touched his hat brim and rode away, leaving nothing but dust and the promise of future trouble. Jacob stood motionless until the hoofbeats faded completely, then walked slowly back to the cabin. Sarah met him at the door, her face pale but her chin set with determination. He knows, she said. He suspects, Jacob corrected. Different thing. You lied for me. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching his description, Jacob said carefully. Far as I'm concerned, the Sarah he described, crazy, helpless, needing rescue from her own choices, doesn't exist. The Sarah I know is strong, intelligent, and capable of deciding her own future. The distinction mattered. Jacob hadn't perjured himself. He'd simply refused to accept her father's version of who she was. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now, we're careful," Jacob replied, "and we prepare." But even as he spoke those words with quiet confidence, the sound of multiple horses approached from the valley below. This time, Sarah knew, it wouldn't be wild mustangs or federal marshals making their rounds. Through the window, she could see a familiar figure riding up the trail, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of weak handsomeness that had once made her heart flutter with young love. James Patterson had come calling, and with him rode complications that would make the marshal's visit look like a social call. James Patterson cut a fine figure in his tailored coat and polished boots. Every inch the successful young banker he'd worked so hard to become. But Sarah saw through the facade to the weakness underneath, the same weakness that had sent him running when she'd needed him most. He dismounted with practiced grace, though Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he tied his horse to the porch rail. Behind him rode two men Sarah didn't recognize, hired muscle, by the look of them, men comfortable with violence but dressed to appear respectable. "Sarah, when your father told me what happened." "Told you what?" Sarah stepped onto the porch, Jacob a solid presence at her shoulder. James's eyes flicked between them, calculating. "That you'd been taken, brought up here against your will by this mountain man." His tone carried just enough disdain to make the words an insult. "I wasn't taken anywhere," Sarah replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I was brought here." "There's a difference. Sarah, sweetheart, you're not thinking clearly." James dismounted and approached the porch with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "The shock of our situation, it's affected your judgment, but I'm here now. I've come to make things right." The casual dismissal of her mental capacity stung worse than any physical blow. In James's world, like her father's, women were simply not equipped to understand their own best interests. "Make things right how?" Sarah asked. James smiled, the charming expression that had once made her heart race. Now it looked calculating, practiced. "By marrying you, of course, by giving our child a proper name and a proper home." "Where were you 3 months ago when I needed you to make things right?" The question hit home. James's smile faltered, and something that might have been genuine shame flickered across his features. I was scared, Sarah. I know that's not manly to admit, but I was young and foolish and terrified, but I've grown up now. I've secured a position with the Territorial Bank, got a house in town, everything we need to start fresh." It was a pretty speech, well rehearsed and probably sincere in its way. But Sarah heard what he didn't say, that he'd only returned after securing his own position, after making sure marriage to her wouldn't hurt his prospects. His timing wasn't about love or responsibility, it was about convenience. "And if I choose not to marry you?" Sarah asked. "Choose?" James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, you're carrying my child. There's no choice to be made here. It's a matter of doing right by everyone involved." "Including her." Jacob spoke for the first time, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of controlled anger. James turned his attention to the mountain man, sizing him up with the arrogance of a man who'd never been in a real fight. "This doesn't concern you. Morrison, Sarah's coming with me where she belongs." "She belongs where she chooses to be," Jacob replied. "She's carrying a Patterson child. That gives me certain rights." "Rights you abandoned when you ran off and left her to face the consequences alone." The words hit James like physical blows. His face flushed red, and his hand moved toward the gun at his hip, a gesture that brought Jacob's hired men to instant alertness. "Easy," one of them muttered. "We're here to collect the girl, not start a war." But James's pride was stung now, his carefully constructed image of noble rescue crumbling in the face of truth. "You've been living in sin with my intended bride," he snarled at Jacob. "Don't lecture me about rights and responsibilities." "I've been treating her with respect," Jacob replied calmly. "Something you might want to try." The confrontation might have escalated then, but the sound of more horses interrupted them. From down the valley came a procession that made Sarah's heart sink, a dozen women from town, led by the preacher's wife, all riding side saddle with the grim determination of a moral crusade. "Oh no," Sarah whispered. The women dismounted with the efficiency of a military operation. Mrs. Pike, the preacher's wife, took the lead. A woman whose idea of Christian charity involved rescuing people from their own bad choices, whether they wanted rescue or not. "Sarah Caldwell," she announced, as if addressing a wayward child. "We've come to take you home where you belong." "This is my home," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction in the face of such organized disapproval. "Living in sin with a man you're not married to?" Mrs. Pike's eyebrows rose in theatrical shock. "Carrying another man's child while playing house with a stranger." "Dear girl, the scandal," Jacob interrupted, "is a bunch of so-called Christian women riding up here to judge someone who's never asked for their opinion." Mrs. Pike's face went purple. "How dare you speak to us that way?" "Then maybe the community needs better representation." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Around them, the gathered crowd shifted restlessly. James and his men, the church ladies, all of them united in their certainty that they knew what was best for Sarah better than Sarah knew herself. "Sarah," Mrs. Pike continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for the mentally deficient, "you've been through a terrible ordeal, but it's over now. Come with us, and we'll help you get your life back on track." "My life is on track," Sarah said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Standing there on the porch, surrounded by people claiming to know her best interests, Sarah felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations crushing down on her. The easy thing would be to go with them, to accept James's proposal or the church lady's rescue, to become the properly repentant woman everyone wanted her to be. But then she felt Jacob's presence beside her, not pushing, not demanding, just there, solid and unwavering, like the mountains themselves. And she remembered the cradle in his workshop, the careful stitching of his mother's quilt, the gentle way he'd tended her rope burns. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Time to think about what?" James demanded. "Sarah, be reasonable. You can't seriously consider—" His words were cut off by a rumble of thunder from the west. Dark clouds were building over the high peaks, promising one of those sudden mountain storms that could trap the unwary for days. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Everyone needs to get off this mountain before the storm hits," she said firmly. "We'll settle this when the weather clears." It wasn't the dramatic choice anyone had expected, but it was practical wisdom born of mountain living. Even James's hired guns looked nervously at the approaching storm clouds. One by one, the various rescue parties mounted up and headed down the valley, promising to return when conditions improved. Only James lingered, his eyes promising that this conversation was far from over. As the storm closed in around the cabin, trapping Sarah and Jacob alone together, she felt the first sharp pain low in her belly, a warning that some storms couldn't be waited out. The pain hit like lightning, sharp, breath-stealing, and completely unexpected. Sarah doubled over on the cabin porch, her hand clutching the doorframe as the storm's first real winds whipped around them. Jacob was at her side instantly, his arm supporting her weight as another contraction gripped her body. "It's too early," she gasped. "The baby's not due for another month." Jacob's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "Sometimes babies make their own schedule. We need to get you inside." The storm was building with the fierce intensity that only mountain weather could muster. Wind howled through the pine trees, bending them nearly horizontal, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Through the gathering darkness, lightning illuminated the valley in stark, violent flashes. There would be no riding for help, no fetching the midwife from town, no doctor with his black bag and reassuring authority. Just Jacob, Sarah, and a baby determined to enter the world in the middle of nature's fury. Inside the cabin, Jacob moved with the swift efficiency of a man facing crisis. He built up the fire, set water to boiling, gathered clean cloths and blankets. His movements were sure, practiced, as if he'd done this before. "How do you know?" Sarah began, then cried out as another contraction tore through her. "Breathe through it," Jacob instructed, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her to the bed. "Don't fight the pain. Work with it." "You've done this before," Sarah realized through gritted teeth. Jacob's hands stilled for just a moment. "Once," he said quietly. "Long time ago." As Sarah labored through the long night, caught between waves of pain that seemed to tear her apart and brief respites that offered only the promise of more agony to come, Jacob's story emerged in fragments between contractions. "Her name was Mary," he said, pressing a cool cloth to Sarah's fevered forehead. "We were engaged to be married. She was carrying our child." Sarah's hand found his, gripping tight as another wave of pain crested. "What happened?" "Same as this. Storm came early, baby came early. I did everything I could, but—" His voice trailed off, heavy with old grief. "Lost them both, Mary and our son." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, even through her own pain. No wonder Jacob had been so careful, so protective. No wonder he'd built a cradle with such loving attention to detail. This birth wasn't just about her and her child. It was Jacob's chance at redemption, his opportunity to save what he couldn't save before. "I won't let that happen again," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "I promise you, Sarah, I won't lose you." The hours blurred together, pain and darkness, lightning and thunder. Jacob's steady voice talking her through each contraction, his skilled hands working to save two lives that had become the center of his world. "I can see the head," Jacob said somewhere near dawn, his voice tight with concentration. "One more push, Sarah, one more." With a final, tearing effort that felt like it split her apart, Sarah brought her son into the world. The baby's cry cut through the storm's noise, thin, reedy, but wonderfully alive. "A boy," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he cleaned the tiny, perfect form. "A healthy boy." Sarah reached for her child with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. The baby was small, but perfectly formed, his little fists waving in protest at this strange new world of cold air and bright light. "Hello, little one," she whispered, pressing her lips to his downy head. "You gave us quite a scare." Jacob worked silently to tend to Sarah, his movements gentle but efficient as he cleaned and wrapped the baby in soft blankets. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, a profound peace had settled over them, the peace that comes after surviving something that might have destroyed them. "What will you name him?" Jacob asked softly, settling the bundled infant in Sarah's arms. Sarah looked down at her son's wrinkled face, then up at the man who had saved both their lives, the man who had lost his own child and fiancée to circumstances just like these, yet had found the courage to try again, to risk his heart on saving them. "Jacob," she said quietly. "Jacob Morrison, Jr." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jacob sank into the chair beside the bed, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her exhaustion. "This child is alive because of you. He has a future because you chose to give him one. In every way that matters, you're his father." Jacob reached out one finger to stroke the baby's cheek, his touch feather light. "Jacob, Jr.," he repeated wonderfully, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "Little Jacob," Sarah agreed, then added with a small smile, "though I think I'll call him Jake. He looks like a Jake." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the storm clouds in shades of gold and pink, the three of them formed something that might have looked like any other family: mother, father, and newborn child, safe in their mountain home. But outside, the clearing skies revealed fresh hoofprints in the mud around the cabin, multiple horses, many riders, all heading up the mountain trail. The respite was over. The world was coming for them, and this time it wasn't taking no for an answer. The riders appeared at first light like something out of a fever dream, her father leading the charge, his face set in lines of righteous fury, followed by James and his hired men, Marshal Thompson with his federal authority, the church ladies in their black dresses, and half the town council besides. Even the preacher himself rode with them, his Bible clutched like a weapon. Sarah clutched baby Jake to her chest, the child's soft breathing a stark contrast to the tension that filled the cabin like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Beside her, Jacob stood at the window, his rifle in easy reach, but not yet lifted. "Quite a gathering," he observed quietly. "They've come to take him," Sarah whispered, protective instincts flaring fierce and bright. "They've come to take my baby." "Our baby," Jacob corrected gently. "And they'll have to go through me first." The posse arranged itself in a rough semicircle around the cabin, like wolves surrounding wounded prey. Ezra Caldwell dismounted first, his authority as the wronged father giving him precedence over the others. "Sarah," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "Come out here, girl. It's time to end this foolishness." Jacob stepped onto the porch first, Sarah close behind him with the baby. The sight of her son seemed to galvanize the crowd. Here was the evidence of her sin, but also the innocent life that needed protecting from her poor choices. "That's my grandson," Ezra declared, his eyes fixed on the bundle in Sarah's arms. "My blood, and I won't have him raised by some mountain savage." "I'm not a savage," Jacob replied calmly, "and he's not your blood to claim." "The hell he isn't!" Ezra's face flushed red. "That's a Caldwell baby, and he belongs with Caldwell family." James stepped forward, his banker's training making him more diplomatic than Ezra, but no less determined. "Sarah, be reasonable. You can't possibly think this is the right environment for a child. No proper schooling, no medical care, no civilization for miles." "He's got love," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He's got 2 parents who want him." "2 parents?" Mrs. Pike's voice dripped scandal. "You're not married, living in sin, raising a bastard child." "Watch your tongue," Jacob's voice cut like a blade. "You're talking about a baby." The preacher cleared his throat importantly. "Perhaps we can resolve this peacefully. Sarah, if you marry young Patterson here, your son will have a legitimate name and a proper Christian upbringing." "I don't want to marry James," Sarah interrupted. "What you want is irrelevant," her father snapped. "You forfeited the right to make decisions when you spread your legs for Patterson and brought shame on our family." The crude words hit like physical blows. But before Sarah could respond, Agnes McKinnon rode into the circle. The old mountain woman dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints had known many hard winters. But her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned her opinions through experience. "Ezra Caldwell," she said, her Scottish accent thick with contempt, "you're a damned fool if you think anyone here doesn't know what kind of father you've been." "This doesn't concern you, Agnes," Ezra warned. "It concerns me when I see decent folk being harassed by hypocrites and cowards." Agnes shot back. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I've known Jacob Morrison for 10 years. He's the finest man in these mountains, honest, hard-working, and kinder than most of you deserve. If he's claimed this girl and her child, then they're blessed beyond measure." "He's not married to her," Mrs. Pike protested. "Marriage is more than words spoken over a book," Agnes replied. "It's choosing to stand by someone when the world turns against them. It's putting their welfare above your own comfort. By that measure, Jacob's been more of a husband to Sarah in 3 months than most men manage in a lifetime." The words stung because they carried truth. Around the circle, Sarah could see faces shifting, people reconsidering their certainty. But her father's voice cut through the moment of doubt. "Enough talk," Ezra declared. "Sarah, you have until sunset to come to your senses. Marry Patterson. Give the boy his proper name, and come back to civilization, or we'll take him anyway and leave you to your mountain man." "You can't," Sarah began. "I can, and I will," her father interrupted. "I've got the law on my side." He gestured to Marshal Thompson. "The unmarried woman, living in sin, no means of support except the charity of a stranger. Any court would agree the child's better off with his legitimate father." Marshal Thompson looked uncomfortable, but nodded reluctantly. "The law does favor traditional family structures," he admitted. The trap was closing around them with the inexorable weight of legal authority and social convention. Sarah looked around the circle of faces, some sympathetic, some judgmental, all united in their certainty that they knew better than she did what was best for her and her child. "What if we were married?" Sarah asked suddenly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Her father's face went purple. James looked like he'd been slapped, and even Jacob turned to stare at her in surprise. "Sarah," Jacob said quietly, "you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If marriage is what it takes to protect Jake, then let's get married, right now." "You can't marry him," James sputtered. "You're promised to me." "I was never promised to you," Sarah replied, with steel in her voice. "You ran away, remember? You abandoned us when we needed you most." Preacher Williams stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable but bound by duty. "Even if I were willing to perform such a ceremony, and I'm not saying I am, there are legal requirements. Bans must be posted, licenses obtained." "Agnes can marry us," Sarah said, remembering something the old woman had mentioned once. "She's a licensed minister, spent 5 years doing missionary work before she came to the mountains." All eyes turned to Agnes, who smiled grimly. I can, and I will, if that's what you both want." The crowd erupted in protests and arguments, but through the chaos, Jacob's quiet voice reached Sarah's ears. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Sarah looked down at baby Jake, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then up at the man who had saved them both. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As the sun reached its zenith overhead, casting short shadows in the dusty yard, Sarah prepared to make the choice that would define the rest of her life. Around them, the crowd waited to see whether love could triumph over law, whether choice could overcome convention. The answer would come with the setting sun, and with it, consequences that none of them could fully foresee. No. But Sarah had found her voice at last, and it rang clear and strong across the mountain meadow. "The biggest mistake of my life was believing that other people knew better than I did what would make me happy." She stepped forward, baby Jake secure in her arms, Jacob solid and reassuring at her side. The crowd watched in fascination as the broken girl they'd come to rescue transformed before their eyes into a woman claiming her own destiny. "I choose Jacob Morrison," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "I choose this life, this home, this man who has shown me nothing but kindness and respect." James stepped forward desperately. "Sarah, you can't be serious. What can this mountain man give you that I can't? I have money, position, a future." "You have everything except what matters most," Sarah replied, her gaze never leaving Jacob's face. "You don't have love." "Love?" James laughed bitterly. "Love doesn't put food on the table or clothes on your back. Love doesn't give you respectability or social standing." "No," Sarah interrupted. "It gives you something better. It gives you someone who sees your worth when the rest of the world sees only your shame." The words hit home, and Sarah could see the moment when James realized he'd lost, not just her, but any claim to moral authority in this situation. His face cycled through anger, hurt, and finally, a desperate calculation. "You want to know about love?" he snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Ask her father how much he loves her. Ask him about the money." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the crowd. "What money?" Marshall Thompson asked, his lawman's instincts suddenly alert. James's smile turned vicious. "Tell them. Ezra. Tell them about our business arrangement." Ezra's face went white, then red, then white again. "Boy, you better watch your tongue. $500? James continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed advantage. That's what Ezra charged me, to take his problem daughter off his hands permanently. Make her disappear, he said. Take her somewhere far away where the family name wouldn't be tainted by her bastard child. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Everything she'd believed about her abandonment suddenly recast in a harsher light. That's not, Ezra began, but James was beyond caring about consequences now. Oh, it gets better, he continued. His banker's precision now turned to destruction. When I got cold feet about the deal, when I started thinking maybe I should do the right thing and marry her after all, Ezra had a better idea. Why not let the mountain man solve the problem? One way or another, Sarah would be gone, and the Caldwell reputation would be safe. You lying son of a... Ezra lunged toward James, but Marshal Thompson caught his arm. Is it true? The marshal demanded, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Did you pay Patterson to get rid of your daughter? The silence stretched like a taut rope, everyone waiting for Ezra's answer. When it came, it was barely a whisper. She brought shame on our family. That's not an answer, Thompson pressed. Did you pay Patterson to remove your daughter from the community? I gave him money for traveling expenses, to take her somewhere she could start fresh. And when he didn't follow through? Ezra's shoulders sagged in defeat. I brought her up here myself. The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Mrs. Pike's hand flew to her throat. The other church ladies began whispering furiously among themselves, and several of the town council members stepped back from Ezra as if his moral corruption might be contagious. You sold your own daughter, Agnes McKinnon said, her voice thick with disgust. Like a piece of livestock you wanted off your hands. I was protecting my family's reputation. You were protecting your own cowardice. Jacob spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute moral certainty. A real man protects his daughter, not his reputation. Marshal Thompson looked around the circle of faces, reading the shift in public opinion like a weather vane reading wind. The wronged father, seeking his daughter's return, had become a corrupt patriarch who'd sold his child to cover his own shame. Seems to me, the marshal said slowly, that Miss Caldwell is exactly where she belongs, with a man who values her for herself, not as a commodity to be traded. Now wait just a minute, Ezra started, but Agnes McKinnon had heard enough. Jacob Morrison, she called out in her clear Scottish voice, do you take this woman as your wife, to love and cherish through whatever may come? I do, Jacob replied without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Sarah Caldwell, do you take this man as your husband, choosing him freely and of your own will? Sarah looked around the circle one last time, at her father's defeated face, at James's bitter disappointment, at the church ladies' scandalized expressions. Then she looked at Jacob, at the man who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go, who had built a cradle for her child, who had risked everything to protect them both. I do, she said, her voice ringing clear and true. Then by the authority vested in me by God and the territorial government, I pronounce you husband and wife. Agnes smiled broadly. Jacob, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, respectful, but it sealed something more than just a legal contract. It sealed a promise, A commitment, a choice made freely by two people who had found something worth fighting for. As they broke apart, Jacob reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, his mother's wedding ring, worn smooth by years of love and labor. "This belonged to my mother," he said, slipping it onto Sarah's finger. "She always said it would belong to the woman I married." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't a marriage of convenience or desperation. It was a claiming, a public declaration that Sarah Morrison, no longer Caldwell, was valued, cherished, and protected. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, some left in disgust, others in satisfaction at seeing justice done. Ezra Caldwell rode away without a word, his authority broken and his reputation in ruins. James followed, his dreams of easy redemption shattered by his own desperate gamble. But a few remained: Agnes McKinnon, Marshall Thompson, and a handful of others who had witnessed something rare and precious. Two people choosing love over convenience, courage over comfort. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sarah Morrison stood on her own porch, her husband's arm around her shoulders, her son sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. But the most beautiful sight of all was the small group of mountain neighbors who had stayed behind, waiting to congratulate the new family and welcome them properly into the community of those who had chosen the hard path of making their own lives on their own terms. The siege was over. Love had won. 6 months had passed since that tumultuous day when love triumphed over law, and the Morrison homestead bore little resemblance to the austere bachelor cabin Sarah had first entered. The single room had been expanded into 3, with a proper kitchen, a nursery for Jake, and even a small parlor where neighbors gathered on Sunday afternoons to share meals and conversation. Sarah stood in the doorway of that parlor now, watching her husband teach young Tommy McKinnon his letters, while Agnes looked on with approval. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder. This quiet, gentle man, who had once lived in complete isolation, had become the unofficial schoolmaster for the scattered children of the mountains. "Mama." The word was clear and unmistakable, spoken by the chubby 6-month-old who had learned to pull himself up on the furniture. But little Jake wasn't looking at Sarah when he spoke. His bright blue eyes were fixed on Jacob, his chubby arms reaching for the man who had claimed him as son from the moment of birth. "That's right, little man," Jacob said, sweeping the boy up with practiced ease. "Papa's here." The legal adoption had been finalized just last week at the county courthouse, the same building where Sarah had once faced judgment and condemnation. But this time, she'd walked in as Mrs. Jacob Morrison, a respected member of the mountain community, with her husband beside her and her son's future secure. Jacob Morrison, Jr., the clerk had read from the official documents. Father, Jacob Morrison. Mother, Sarah Morrison. Simple words that carried the weight of legal protection and social recognition. The name change had been Sarah's idea, no longer Sarah Caldwell, carrying the shame of her father's rejection. No longer Sarah Patterson, bound by another man's claim on her body and her child. Sarah Morrison, a woman who had chosen her own identity and her own destiny. That evening, as they had every evening for months now, the family gathered around the fireplace after supper. Sarah worked on a new quilt, her first, taught by Agnes's patient hands, while Jacob read aloud from the territorial newspaper, and Jake played with wooden blocks carved by his father's skilled hands. "Says here the territorial governor is coming through next month," Jacob mentioned, looking up from the paper. "Plans to visit all the mountain communities, see how we're faring." "Will he stop here?" Sarah asked, not because she was eager for official attention, but because she'd learned to take pride in what they'd built together. "Might. Agnes thinks he should see how a proper mountain community operates." It was true. What had started as a few isolated homesteads had grown into something that resembled civilization, not the rigid, judgmental civilization Sarah had fled, but something warmer and more accepting. Neighbors helped neighbors without asking questions about their past. Children learned together regardless of their parents' circumstances, and people were judged by their actions in the present, not their mistakes from yesterday. Sarah's fingers found the small wooden box Jacob had made to hold her treasures: wedding ring, a pressed flower from her bridal bouquet, baby Jake's first tooth. But at the bottom of the box lay something else, a piece of rope, charred black around the edges. She'd asked Jacob to save it when they'd burned the original rope in the fireplace last winter, the rope her father had used to drag her up the mountain like unwanted cargo. Now it served as a reminder of how far she'd come, how much she'd changed from the broken girl who'd arrived here believing she deserved nothing better than whatever scraps the world chose to give her. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, setting down the newspaper. "The governor's visit," Sarah replied, though it wasn't exactly the truth. She was thinking about the woman she'd become, the strength she'd found, the voice she'd discovered in the months since that terrifying day when she'd stood before a hostile crowd and chosen her own path. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Visitors after dark were unusual, but not unheard of in the mountains, where travelers sometimes needed shelter from sudden storms or unexpected dangers. Jacob opened the door to reveal a young woman, clearly pregnant, with tear-stained cheeks and clothes that spoke of hasty flight. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my name is Mary Chen. I was told you might help someone like me." Sarah was on her feet instantly, her protective instincts flaring. She recognized the look in the girl's eyes, the same desperate hope mixed with bone-deep shame that she'd once carried. "Come in," Sarah said warmly, taking the girl's cold hands in hers. "You're safe here." As they settled Mary Chen at their table with hot food and warm blankets, Sarah caught Jacob's eye across the room. No words were needed. They both understood that their home had become something more than a private sanctuary. It had become a place where society's cast-offs could find acceptance, where broken people could heal, where love could triumph over judgment. The circle was complete. The woman who had once needed rescue was now in a position to offer rescue to others. The shame that had once defined her had transformed into strength that could lift up those who followed her path. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of what promised to be a long mountain winter. But inside the Morrison home, warmth and love created their own season of hope. As Sarah tucked baby Jake into his hand-carved cradle, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected turns that had brought her to this place, this man, this life she never could have imagined when her father first dragged her up that mountain trail. The little boy's eyes fluttered closed, one tiny fist wrapped around his father's finger, completely secure in the love that surrounded him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and serve and love. But tonight, all was peace in the Morrison home. The healing was complete. The family was whole, and love, patient, persistent, redemptive love, had won. The narrator's voice softens, becoming more intimate, as if speaking directly to each listener. Now, I reckon some of you folks might be wondering if this old story really happened, or if it's just the kind of tale we tell ourselves when the world seems too hard, too cold, too quick to judge. Well, let me tell you what I know for certain. There have been plenty of Jacobs walking this earth, men who look past what society says about a person and see the heart underneath. Maybe you've known someone like that mountain man yourself. Could have been your granddaddy, teaching you that a person's worth isn't measured by their worst mistake, but by how they treat others when nobody's watching. Might have been a neighbor who helped when times got tough, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. Or perhaps it was you, stepping up when somebody needed defending, even when it wasn't the popular thing to do. You see, the thing about dignity, friends, is that it can't be taken away from the outside. Oh, folks can try. They can shame you, abandon you, treat you like you're worth nothing at all. Your own family can turn their backs. Your community can cast you out. And the whole world can act like you don't deserve basic human kindness. But true dignity, that comes from how you treat others when they've got nothing left to give you back. Jacob didn't save Sarah because she was perfect or deserving by society's standards. He saved her because she was human. And in his book, that was enough. In this old world of ours, we're mighty quick to judge and slow to forgive. We see the worst in people before we look for the best. We measure folks by their failures instead of their capacity for growth. But every now and then, if we're paying attention, we witness something beautiful. One person choosing love over judgment, acceptance over condemnation, hope over fear. And that baby grew up knowing he was wanted, knowing he belonged, knowing that the man who raised him had chosen him out of love, not obligation. Sarah learned she was worthy of respect, worthy of protection, worthy of the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be perfect, just asks you to be real. And Jacob? Well, he discovered that sometimes the family you choose means more than the one you're born into, that sometimes God sends His greatest blessings wrapped in packages the world has labeled worthless. So next time you see somebody that life's been hard on, maybe a young woman who's made choices others disapprove of, maybe a child who doesn't fit the usual mold, maybe just another human being who's carrying more pain than most folks can see, remember this story, remember Jacob. Remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply treat someone like they matter, because in the end, that's what we're all looking for, isn't it? Just someone to see us as worthy of love, worthy of a second chance, worthy of basic human dignity. We all need someone who'll build us a cradle when the world says we don't deserve shelter, who will wrap us in family love when our own blood turns cold, who will stand beside us when everybody else walks away. The narrator pauses, letting the words settle like dust after a summer rain. If this old tale touched your heart the way it touched mine, I'd be much obliged if you'd pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. Share it with folks who believe in second chances, in the power of choosing love over judgment, in the idea that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Because Lord knows, we could all use a reminder that grace still exists in this world, that love still wins more often than we think, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones built not by blood or law, but by choice, commitment, and the radical decision to see worth where others see only shame. A gentle pause. The mountains are still there, friends. And so are the people who choose love over fear, who build cradles for unwanted babies, who offer their hand to help someone stand. Look for them. Be one of them. The world needs more Jacobs, more Sarahs, more people willing to choose the harder path of love. Until we meet again with another story of hope. Remember, you are worthy of dignity, worthy of love, and worthy of a place at someone's table. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. The story ends with the gentle crackle of a dying fire and the promise of dawn breaking over distant mountains.